I went into labor alone at 3 a.m. because my husband Charles wouldn't answer his phone, and when I got home from giving birth, he was passed out with a needle in his arm while our newborn needed feeding. He grabbed my hands and promised that when I got sick or old, he'd be there for me, like I was there for him. But when I got cancer, he slept on the couch and said medical stuff triggered his recovery. 3 years later, his lawyer called me to her office and laid out 147 pages of screenshots and recordings where Charles had been documenting my abuse for years while planning to take full custody of our daughter. I went into labor alone at 3 a.m. because my husband Charles wouldn't answer his phone, and when I got home from giving birth, he was passed out with a needle in his arm while our newborn needed feeding. He grabbed my hands and promised that when I got sick or old, he'd be there for me like I was there for him. But when I got cancer, he slept on the couch and said medical stuff triggered his recovery. 3 years later, his lawyer called me to her office and laid out 147 pages of screenshots and recordings where Charles had been documenting my abuse for years while planning to take full custody of our daughter. I went into labor alone at 3 a.m. because my loving husband Charles wouldn't answer his phone for 6 hours. This was the third time he'd abandoned me during an emergency. First when I had the miscarriage scare at 10 weeks and bled alone on our bathroom floor. Then when my dad had his heart attack and I needed someone to drive me to the hospital. When I got home from giving birth, he was passed out with a needle in his arm and our newborn needed feeding. I kicked him awake and told him to get clean or get out. He grabbed my hands and looked me right in the eyes and promised that when I got sick or old or needed anything, he would be there exactly like I was there for him, clean or not. He said that's what marriage really meant, and he finally understood it. For 6 months, it looked like he might actually keep that promise. He went to AA meetings every single day and got a job at his uncle's warehouse. He did the night feedings with our daughter and let me sleep. Every Tuesday at his group, he would talk about how I was his angel and how he owed me his entire life. The leader asked me to come speak once, and Charles held my hand the whole time. The cracks started small like they always do. First, he missed my birthday because of a mandatory work event that I later found out was optional. Then he forgot our anniversary completely, and when I brought it up, he said I shouldn't need a special date to know he loved me. When I got promoted to charge nurse, he sulked for 3 days and made snide comments about how nice it must be to have time for career advancement while he was stuck in recovery. I found out from a mutual friend that he'd been telling people at meetings that I held his addiction over his head. He said I was controlling and that I monitored his every move like a warden. The truth was, I hadn't checked his phone or asked about his whereabouts in months. When I got the flu that winter, he slept on the couch because he couldn't afford to miss work. He never once brought me soup or medicine or even a glass of water. I asked him about it when I felt better, and he said I was being dramatic about a little cold. Then I found the lump in my breast while showering. My hands went numb and I called for Charles, but he was playing video games with headphones on. I scheduled the biopsy myself and reminded him 3 times about the appointment. He forgot anyway and said he had to work. The results came back stage 2 cancer, and when I told him, he went pale and said medical stuff triggered his recovery. I said I understood, even though understanding felt like swallowing glass. My mother moved in the next week without asking. She drove me to every chemo appointment while Charles found reasons to be somewhere else. I kept wearing my wedding ring through it all, even when my fingers swelled from the treatment. The same ring I'd worn through his entire rehab when I was working myself to death to pay for it. 8 months of pure hell, and I beat it. Charles threw a huge party for my recovery and posted all over social media about supporting his warrior wife. He'd attended exactly 2 appointments, and both times he stayed in the waiting room on his phone. 3 years passed, and I'd started to forget what his promises sounded like. Then my phone rang at 2 a.m., and it was county jail. Charles had relapsed and gotten a DUI and totaled our car. His voice was slurred when he begged me to bail him out. He actually said the words, "You know I was there for your cancer." And that's when I laughed. Not a bitter laugh, but a real one, because the audacity was almost funny. I told him he was there for Instagram and my mother was there for cancer. Then I hung up and went back to sleep next to my new husband, who was the oncology nurse that held my hair during chemo. Charles lost his job and his apartment. His parents wouldn't take him in because he'd stolen from them before. Last I heard, he was living in the same shelter where I used to volunteer during his first stint in rehab. The bed he sleeps in might be one I made with my own hands while he was getting high in our bathroom. And for a while, I didn't care. I thought I was doing the right thing. But that's when I got the call. It was his lawyer, one I didn't even know he had. He'd been documenting my abuse for years. Screenshots, recordings, twisted versions of every fight. Rachel Torres sat across from me in her downtown office 3 days later with a leather folder thick enough to be a phone book. She opened it slowly like she was enjoying this and started laying out pages one by one on the conference table between us. The first page was a screenshot from 2 years ago where I'd texted Charles that if he didn't show up for Emma's birthday, I'd never forgive him. She'd highlighted the word never in yellow. The next page was an audio transcript from an AA meeting where Charles said I threatened to take Emma away if he relapsed, and someone had actually recorded it on their phone. Page after page came out while she talked about emotional abuse and parental alienation and how Charles just wanted to be a good father. She said he'd been documenting everything for years while planning his recovery and his legal strategy at the same time. The stack grew until it covered half the table, and she said this was just the highlights from 147 pages total. She pushed a custody petition across to me that demanded full physical custody of Emma with supervised visits for me twice a month. At the bottom was a request for spousal support of $3,000 monthly based on my income as a charge nurse and his current unemployment due to trauma from our marriage. My hands were shaking so bad I couldn't even pick up the papers. She said I had 10 days to respond and that Charles was willing to settle for joint custody if I agreed to the support payments. I walked out of that office on legs that felt like water and somehow made it to my car before I threw up in the parking garage. I called Evan and he heard me crying before I could even speak. He left his shift at the hospital immediately, even though it meant getting written up. We sat in that parking garage for 3 hours with Emma sleeping in her car seat while we went through every single piece of Charles's evidence on on my phone. Evan kept pointing out the dates and showing me how Charles was collecting this stuff while I was literally paying for his rehab. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I kept thinking about every fight we'd ever had and wondering if I really had been controlling or cruel without realizing it. Evan held me, but he didn't say it would be okay because we both knew it might not be. The next morning, I emptied Emma's college fund to hire David Brennan, who specialized in custody cases involving addiction. $12,000 that took me 3 years to save handed over in a single check. Brennan went through Charles's documentation for 2 hours making notes and finally looked up and said the bad news was that family courts love a redemption story. The good news was that Charles's evidence showed clear manipulation, but judges don't always see it that way. He said we needed to document everything from this point forward and file for an emergency custody order before Charles tried anything else. 5 days later, the daycare director called me at work. Charles was there claiming it was his scheduled visitation day, even though no custody arrangement existed yet. She said Emma was crying, and Charles was telling her that mommy wouldn't let him see her. I drove there so fast I'm surprised I didn't get pulled over. When I got there, Charles was kneeling next to Emma telling her daddy had been sick, but now he was all better, and mommy was being mean by keeping them apart. The director had already called the police, but Charles left before they arrived. He posted on Facebook that night about being denied access to his daughter, with a photo of him crying outside the daycare. 3 days later, Brennan filed for an emergency custody order, but the hearing wouldn't be for 2 weeks. Meanwhile, Charles's Facebook post had over 300 comments from people calling me a monster for keeping a father from his child. My mom flew in from Florida the next week carrying a cardboard box that she'd been keeping in her garage. Inside were appointment cards from every single chemo session with dates and times, parking receipts showing she'd paid for hospital parking 47 times, photos of her holding my hand during treatment while Charles was nowhere in any of them. She'd kept everything without telling me because she said she knew this day might come. At the emergency hearing, Judge Patricia Hoffman barely looked at my evidence. She spent 20 minutes praising Charles for his commitment to recovery and his desire to rebuild his relationship with Emma. She granted him supervised visitation every Saturday at a court facility and said she was impressed by his dedication to sobriety. When Brennan brought up the abandonment during my cancer, she said that addiction is a disease and we shouldn't punish people for being sick. The first supervised visit was a disaster. The supervisor wrote in her report that Charles told Emma that daddy had been very sick, but mommy wouldn't help him get better. She noted it as concerning but not severe enough to restrict access. Emma came home confused and asking why I didn't help daddy when he was sick. I found out from a friend that Charles had started going to a different AA group across town where nobody knew our history. He was telling them I'd weaponized his addiction against him and used his disease to steal his daughter. 3 members had already written character letters for his lawyer saying what a devoted father he was and how cruel I was being. Evan found me crying in the kitchen that night and pulled me into his arms while I shook with rage about the character letters. He grabbed a yellow legal pad from the drawer and said we needed to start writing down everything that happened with Charles from now on. Charles documented everything while she was paying for his rehab. That timing feels really calculated to me. Makes me wonder if he was planning this custody battle even back when he was promising to be there for her. We went to Target the next morning and bought a thick notebook with a lock on it and started our own documentation. Every text message got printed and taped inside with a date and time written in the margins. Every pickup and drop-off got logged with details about Emma's mood and what Charles said or didn't say. Evan took photos of Emma before and after visits showing how her hair went from neat braids to tangled messes and how she came back in the same clothes we sent her in. The notebook filled up fast, and we bought another one within a month. 2 weeks later, Brennan called to say he was trying to get Charles's AA records from his first group, where people knew the real story. The group leader refused to hand them over and said they were protected by confidentiality rules even with a subpoena. Brennan filed for a court order, but the judge said we'd need a hearing first, which meant another $3,000 in legal fees and at least 6 more weeks of waiting. The first custody mediation happened on a Tuesday morning in a beige conference room that smelled like old coffee. Charles showed up in a new suit with Rachel beside him, and when the mediator asked him to explain his position, he started sobbing, real tears running down his face as he talked about how I'd never supported his recovery and how my coldness had triggered his relapse. Rachel pulled out a letter from a therapist I'd never heard of saying Charles had PTSD from our toxic marriage and needed stability to heal. The mediator nodded along and took notes while I sat there with my mouth hanging open at the lies. When it was my turn to speak, the mediator cut me off after 2 minutes and said we needed to focus on the future, not the past. She suggested a graduated visitation schedule where Charles would get Emma every other weekend at first, then work up to 50-50 custody within 6 months. I brought up his absence during my cancer treatment, and she actually said past medical issues shouldn't prevent a parent from building a future relationship with their child. Brennan kicked me under the table when I started to argue, and we took a break where he explained that mediators always pushed for shared custody no matter what. That evening my phone rang, and it was Dr. Vasquez calling after my mother had reached out to her. She was absolutely disgusted when she heard what was happening and immediately offered to testify about all the times I'd shown up alone to chemo. She remembered specific dates when I'd thrown up in the parking lot with no one to help me and had to call an Uber home because I was too sick to drive. She said she'd kept notes in my file about my lack of support system and would gladly tell any judge who'd listen. A week later, I got a Facebook message from Tommy, Charles's uncle from the warehouse. He said he'd been wrestling with his conscience and needed to tell me something important. Charles hadn't been working extra shifts during my cancer like he'd claimed, but had actually been getting high in the bathroom at work. Tommy had covered for him multiple times and even drove him home once when he was too messed up to stand. He felt terrible about staying quiet, but said family was complicated, and he'd thought Charles would get it together for Emma. He offered to write a statement or testify if I needed him to. Rachel must have gotten wind of our witness list because she filed a motion the next day to exclude Dr. Vasquez's testimony. She argued it was irrelevant to current custody custody matters, and prejudicial against a parent in recovery. She also demanded all my medical records, claiming she needed to verify if I was physically and mentally capable of providing proper care for Emma. Brennan said this was standard intimidation tactics, but it still made me want to scream. Emma started having nightmares around this time, and would wake up crying about Daddy taking her away. She'd cling to me at drop-offs and beg not to go with him. I wrote everything down in our notebook and took videos of her crying, but when Charles found out, he accused me of coaching her. He demanded she be evaluated by a child psychologist to prove I wasn't turning her against him. The court-appointed doctor, Jennifer Mills, who scheduled separate observations with both of us. Emma was her normal, happy self during my session, and played with blocks while chatting about her preschool friends. But during Charles's evaluation, she went quiet and wouldn't leave his side even when he brought a whole bag of new toys to win her over. Dr. Mills took notes but wouldn't tell either of us what she was thinking. Meanwhile, Brennan had been digging into Charles's finances and discovered he hadn't filed taxes in 3 years. He owed $47,000 to the IRS and had been lying about having a steady job. When we brought this up in court, Rachel argued his tax issues were a direct result of his disease of addiction and shouldn't be held against him. She actually used the phrase medical condition with a straight face while talking about him choosing not to pay taxes. 3 weeks later, we were back in court, and Judge Hoffman looked worried about something Jennifer had written in her report about Emma having nightmares after visits. She said the nightmares might be signs of parental alienation and ordered us both to attend family therapy sessions together starting next week. I tried to explain that Charles had manipulated every professional we'd met, but she cut me off and said therapy would help us learn to co-parent better. The first session was exactly what I expected because Charles had done this dance before. He sat there speaking so quietly the therapist had to lean forward to hear him talk about taking responsibility for his disease and how he just wanted to heal and be a good father. He actually wiped away tears when he said I was keeping him from moving forward by holding on to old resentments, and the therapist nodded along like she was watching a heartbreaking movie. When I tried to bring up the stolen money or the times he'd left me alone during emergencies, she redirected the conversation to focus on forgiveness and moving forward for Emma's sake. After that session, I locked myself in our bathroom and cried harder than I had since chemo, while Evan sat on the floor outside the door, reminding me that we had evidence and truth on our side, even if nobody wanted to see it yet. The next week, my mother ran into Charles outside the courthouse and lost it completely, calling him a pathological liar and a junkie who'd never change. Rachel filed a restraining order request that same afternoon, claiming my mother was harassing a recovering addict who was just trying to rebuild his life and be a father to his daughter. Jennifer's preliminary report came out 2 days later, and it was worse than I thought because she wrote that both parents were capable, but noted my resistance to co-parenting as a concern that needed addressing. She recommended increasing Charles's visitation from supervised visits at the center to unsupervised afternoon visits twice a week starting immediately. Brennan said we could appeal, but it would make me look even more resistant to co-parenting, so we had to just accept it and document everything. I spent the next week calling nurses from the oncology ward who'd seen Charles show up high during my treatment, and 3 of them agreed to write affidavits about what they'd witnessed. But then hospital legal got involved and warned them that getting involved in personal legal matters could affect their employment, so 2 backed out immediately, and the 3rd said she'd think about it, but never got back to me. Emma's first unsupervised visit was supposed to be a trip to the park, but she came back with chocolate all over her face and dress, talking about going to a house with lots of people where Daddy's friends gave her candy. When Brennan asked Charles about it at the next hearing, he said Emma was confused and making things up like kids do, and Jennifer actually wrote in her notes that I might be coaching Emma to say negative things. I downloaded a recording app on my phone and got Charles on tape at the next pickup, telling Emma that Evan wasn't her real family, and real families don't have 2 daddies. Brennan said it was good evidence, but Wisconsin's 2-party consent laws meant we'd have to be really careful about how we used it, or it could backfire and make me look like I was spying on him. Tommy finally called me after Charles showed up at the warehouse drunk and threatened him for betraying family by not supporting him in court. He said he'd testify and gave us employment records showing Charles was actually fired for stealing tools and selling them, not laid off like he'd been claiming. During Emma's bath time the next week, she looked up at me with her big brown eyes and asked why Daddy said I was mean to him when he loved me so much. I sat there on the bathroom floor trying to find words a 3-year-old could understand about addiction and mental health without making her father sound like a monster, because the court therapist said disparaging the other parent was emotional abuse. I told Emma that sometimes grown-ups have different ideas about things and dried her off with her favorite dinosaur towel. The next week we sat in family therapy with Charles across from us while he told the therapist how I'd poisoned his whole family against him, and that's why Tommy was testifying for me now. The therapist nodded and wrote notes about competitive parenting, while Charles kept talking about how I'd turned everyone against him, and Emma sat there coloring between us. I wanted to scream that Tommy called me himself after Charles stole $800 from his truck, but I just sat there watching Emma draw flowers. Rachel sent over a stack of papers the size of a phone book demanding every single work schedule I'd had for the past 5 years. She highlighted every 12-hour shift, and every weekend I'd worked, and wrote notes in the margins about how absent mothers lose custody. Talk about playing chess while your opponent flips the board and calls it strategy. Charles turns waterworks into weapons, and somehow the mediator thinks tissues equal truth. My lawyer pointed out that I'd worked those shifts to pay for Charles's 3rd rehab, but Rachel said that was irrelevant to current parenting capacity. Dr. Vasquez came to court with a binder full of dates and receipts showing every single appointment I'd gone to alone. She had Uber receipts from when I couldn't afford hospital parking after paying for Charles's treatment, and photos she'd taken of me sleeping in the chemo chair with no one beside me. She testified for 2 hours about watching me fight cancer basically alone while my husband was supposedly in recovery. 2 months into the whole mess, Charles brought his new AA sponsor to testify, and this guy went on for 40 minutes about how Charles was the most dedicated person in recovery jury he'd ever met. He talked about Charles's commitment and his honesty and his dedication to sobriety, while the judge took notes and nodded along. The sponsor had no idea about the needles or the lies or the times Charles had stolen from the collection basket at meetings. During the next custody exchange, Charles bent down to tie Emma's shoe and something fell out of his jacket pocket that looked exactly like a needle. He grabbed it fast and shoved it back in his pocket and said it was an EpiPen for his new peanut allergy, but Emma saw it and asked what the pointy thing was. I took photos with my phone while he fumbled with excuses about medical conditions he'd never had before. My lawyer filed for immediate drug testing based on the needle, but Rachel went nuclear, saying we were harassing a recovering addict and threatening to file complaints with the state bar about discrimination. She said requiring drug tests for someone in recovery was like making a cancer patient prove they weren't faking, and the judge actually seemed to consider this. Then the judge ordered both of us to take drug tests within 24 hours to be fair and balanced. Charles passed his test clean, which made me look like a paranoid crazy person trying to frame him. Tommy called me crying that night, saying Charles had bragged about carrying fake pee for weeks just in case, and he didn't know what to do with that information. Charles filed emergency papers the next morning claiming I was mentally unstable from PTSD, and my cancer treatments had made me see danger everywhere. He wanted Emma immediately and permanently with supervised visits for me once a month. His filing said I was creating hostile environments and false accusations that were damaging Emma's relationship with her father. My whole oncology unit went into battle mode when they heard with 5 nurses and 2 doctors calling my lawyer offering to testify. The judge said 1 witness was enough and only let Dr. Vasquez speak for the medical team, even though the others had seen everything too. 10 weeks into this nightmare, Emma brought home a picture from daycare of our family with me and her and Evan all holding hands under a rainbow. Her teacher told me that when she asked Emma where Daddy was, Emma said he was at the place with the strangers where everyone sits in a circle and talks about being sad. That same week, my lawyer Brennan called me into his office and showed me something on his laptop that made my stomach drop. Charles had been recording our phone calls for months and editing them to make me look unstable. In one recording from when Emma was sick with the flu and I'd worked a 12-hour shift, he'd cut out the part where I asked him 3 times to pick her up from daycare. All that remained was my exhausted voice saying those 4 words that haunted me for weeks. The digital forensics expert Brennan brought in cost $3,000 just for the initial analysis, and she found 17 more edited recordings on the USB drive Charles submitted as evidence. She showed us the wave patterns where he'd cut out entire sections of our conversations and spliced different calls together to create fake arguments. The worst one was from the night I'd called him crying after my mammogram came back suspicious, and he'd told me I was being dramatic about nothing. He'd edited it to sound like I was having a mental breakdown about Emma spilling juice on the carpet. The expert said she could prove the manipulation in court, but it would cost another $10,000 minimum for the full forensic report and testimony. Evan and I were already drowning in legal fees when his parents showed up at our door with a check for $15,000. His mother held my hands and said they'd already started the paperwork to mortgage their house if we needed more. These people who'd only known me for 2 years were risking their retirement while Charles's own family had cut him off completely. 3 months into the proceedings, the guardian ad litem interviewed Emma again at her daycare. The teacher later told me Emma had grabbed a toy syringe from the doctor playset and pushed it against her arm while saying something about Daddy's special medicine. The guardian wrote in her report that children often misinterpret adult behaviors, and Emma might have seen Charles taking vitamins or allergy shots. 2 weeks later, we had our first family therapy session with a court-appointed counselor who specialized in high-conflict custody cases. Charles spent 20 minutes talking about how abandoned he felt during my cancer treatment, and then mentioned specific details about my chemo schedule that he'd previously claimed not to remember. The therapist asked him how he knew I had treatments every 3rd Thursday if he'd never attended, and Charles stammered something about checking my calendar. She made a note and started asking him more pointed questions about his involvement during my illness. That night at 2 in the morning, Evan woke me up because he'd heard a car engine idling outside. Charles was parked across the street just sitting there in the dark watching our house. Evan called the police, but they said without a restraining order, a father had the right to drive by his child's home. The next morning, Tommy called Brennan's office with screenshots of text messages between him and Charles from 6 months ago. Charles had bragged about documenting everything for a custody battle and joked that my cancer sob story wouldn't work in court anymore. In one message, he actually used those exact words about my stupid cancer card not working. Rachel tried to get the text thrown out, claiming Tommy was biased because Charles had stolen tools from his garage, but the judge said he'd allow them with a warning to the jury about considering the source. 4 weeks later, an envelope arrived at Brennan's office with no return address containing a flash drive of AA meeting recordings from 2 years ago. Charles's own sponsor had recorded the sessions for the group's archives, and in 3 separate meetings, Charles admitted he'd been using during my chemo and talked about planning to take Emma from me as payback for kicking him out. The recordings were crystal clear and time-stamped, and Charles had signed a consent form allowing the meetings to be recorded for group purposes. Emma's play therapist called me that afternoon to discuss a breakthrough from their session where Emma had used her dolls to act out Daddy giving himself shots in the bathroom and telling the mommy doll she was mean and crazy. The therapist carefully documented every detail and said she'd need to report this to the guardian ad litem immediately. My lawyer filed the motion to admit the AA recordings the next morning, and Rachel went ballistic in court. She kept saying it violated confidentiality, but the judge cut her off and reminded her that Charles had brought AA witnesses himself, so he'd open that door. The court clerk scheduled us for a hearing 3 weeks out to review all the new evidence. Evan took time off work to be there with me while the forensics expert showed the judge how Charles had edited those recordings. The expert had both versions on his laptop and played them side by side so everyone could hear the parts Charles had cut out. In the original recordings, I was crying and begging Charles to get help for Emma's sake. In Charles's version, it sounded like I was threatening him. Rachel kept calling calling it perspective differences, but even she looked uncomfortable when the expert showed how Charles had spliced words from different conversations together. The visitation monitor submitted her report that same week, and it made my stomach turn. She wrote that Charles kept asking Emma strange questions about Evan during their supervised visits at the community center. He'd ask if Evan ever yelled at Mommy or if she was scared when Evan was around. Emma just kept telling him about the butterflies Evan was teaching her to paint on her bedroom wall. 4 months into all this mess, Jennifer finally submitted her guardian ad litem report to the court. She recommended Emma stay in therapy and said there were concerning patterns in Charles's behavior that needed addressing. She suggested keeping visitation supervised only, which made Charles lose it completely right there in the courtroom. He stood up and started yelling that I'd poisoned everyone against him, including his own daughter. The bailiff had to step forward and Charles sat back down, but everyone saw his real face that day. Judge Hoffman ordered another continuation to review everything and said she was troubled by what she'd seen, but reminded us that recovery deserved compassion. 2 days after court, my phone rang at midnight and it was the county jail again. Charles had gotten another DUI, and this time they found Emma's car seat in the back, even though she wasn't with him. The officer said his blood alcohol was 0.18 and he'd been parked outside our house when they pulled him over. Rachel filed to withdraw from his case the next morning, citing irreconcilable differences with her client. Charles was scrambling to find someone new while out on bail and ended up with a public defender who looked about 12 years old. Rachel comparing drug tests to cancer patient discrimination has me wondering what law school taught that logic. The timing of Charles passing that test right after the needle incident seems awfully convenient. Tommy's midnight confession about the fake pee explains a lot about how someone actively using stays clean for court. Once Charles's visits got suspended because of the DUI, Emma started sleeping through the night again for the first time in months. She stopped asking about Daddy's medicine and started eating better too. Evan would read her stories at bedtime, and she'd actually laugh again instead of that worried look she'd been wearing. The new public defender asked for 30 days to review the case, and the judge granted it, which meant more waiting while Charles spiraled. Then last week, Charles showed up at the hospital during my shift and started screaming in the emergency department that I'd set him up. He was drunk, and security had to drag him out while he kept yelling that I'd ruined his life. The hospital banned him from the property, and my supervisor filed a police report. My mother started noticing Charles's beat-up Honda parked at the end of our street almost every night after that hospital incident. She'd take pictures with her phone showing the date and time, and we kept them all in a folder on my laptop. The third time she spotted him, she walked right up to his car and knocked on the window, but he drove off before she could say anything. We filed for a restraining order, but the judge said parking on a public street wasn't enough for harassment. Meanwhile, my lawyer finally got those AA recordings admitted as evidence after fighting about it for weeks. I sat in the courtroom listening to Charles's own voice telling his group how he played the victim during my cancer treatment and knew exactly what he was doing when he stayed away. The judge's face changed when she heard him laughing about how I believed his excuses about medical triggers. Then out of nowhere, Charles's parents called my lawyer saying they wanted to testify. They drove up from Florida with boxes of bank statements and receipts showing how Charles stole their credit cards and pawned their jewelry during the exact months he claimed he was sober and supporting me through chemo. His mother cried when she showed me the pawn shop receipt for her mother's wedding ring dated 2 days after my first treatment. The guardian ad litem Jennifer interviewed Emma 3 more times, and each session got worse. Emma kept repeating phrases that didn't sound like a 4-year-old, and when Jennifer asked where she heard them, Emma said Daddy taught her what to say about Mommy being mean. Jennifer recommended supervised visits only with a professional present to document any coaching. Evan took time off work to go with me to Emma's dance recital since Charles was supposedly in court-ordered rehab after the DUI. Emma danced to some Disney song in her little pink tutu and never once looked around for her dad or asked why he wasn't there. The other parents kept giving me these looks like they all knew the whole story. 2 weeks later, Tommy called me at work completely freaking out. He'd been doing inventory at the warehouse and found packages addressed to fake names that Charles had been having delivered there for months. Tommy had pulled security footage showing Charles picking them up after hours using the spare key he'd copied. The packages traced back to some sketchy online pharmacy selling pills without prescriptions. Tommy gave everything to the police and to my lawyer and said he felt sick about not catching it sooner. Charles's criminal case for the DUI moved forward, and his public defender convinced him to plead no contest. The judge gave him 2 years probation and 90 days in rehab, which he had to complete or he'd serve 6 months in county. My lawyer said this would help our custody case, since it proved ongoing substance abuse. While going through discovery documents, my lawyer's assistant found something weird on one of Charles's computers they'd seized. He'd been posting on these forums for divorced dads using a fake name, but describing our exact situation, asking for advice on beating the system. People were telling him to claim parental alienation and document everything I did wrong, and one guy even suggested he should hurt himself and blame me. My lawyer printed out over 200 pages of these posts, including ones where Charles admitted he was still using and just needed to look clean long enough to get custody. The rehab facility called the court after Charles failed 3 drug tests in his first month there. They found pills hidden in his room during a search and caught him trying to buy more from another patient. He got kicked out of the program, which meant automatic probation violation, and the criminal judge issued a bench warrant. The family court judge called both lawyers into her chambers to review everything we'd submitted. She stayed in there for 2 hours going through the AA recordings and Tommy's evidence and all those forum posts. When she came out, she looked genuinely disturbed and said she needed time to consider such serious allegations, but that Charles's visitation would remain suspended pending her decision. 6 months dragged by with depositions and hearings and mountains of paperwork before we finally got to the real custody trial. Charles walked into the courtroom looking like he'd lost 30 pounds, and his suit hung off him like he'd borrowed it from someone bigger. His new lawyer stood up and started talking about addiction being a disease and how Charles deserved one more chance to prove himself as a father. I watched the judge take notes while my lawyer organized organized her papers and waited for her turn. Dr. Vasquez took the stand first and told the court about the times she'd seen me checking myself out against medical advice after chemo treatments because I had to get home to Emma. She described finding me passed out in the hospital bathroom from exhaustion and dehydration because I'd been trying to care for a toddler while poison dripped through my veins. Charles kept his head down during her testimony, but his hands were shaking on the table. His parents went next, and his mother could barely get the words out about finding Charles unconscious in their bathroom during my third round of chemo. She'd gone to get my pain medication they were holding for me and found the bottle empty next to their son's body. The paramedics had to use Narcan twice to bring him back while I was at home, throwing up from treatment and trying to keep Emma entertained. My lawyer presented all the forensic evidence Tommy had gathered, including the edited recordings and the timeline showing how Charles had been planning his custody grab for years, not months. The IT expert explained how the recordings had been spliced together and showed the original files where Charles was actually the one screaming while I stayed calm. Charles's lawyer objected over and over, but the judge allowed it all into evidence. Then Charles took the stand himself, and that's when everything fell apart for him. Under questioning, he finally admitted he'd been using drugs throughout my entire cancer treatment, but swore he was different now. My lawyer asked him point blank if he was currently sober, and he said yes, but his pupils were huge, and he kept wiping his nose. She asked again, and he started crying, and admitted he'd used that morning just to calm his nerves for court. The judge's face went completely still, and she called for an immediate recess. Out in the hallway, Charles's mother came up to me with tears running down her face and said she should have spoken up sooner, but she'd been so afraid of losing her son completely. She grabbed my hands and apologized for everything he'd put me through, and said she understood if I never wanted to see any of them again. When we went back and Charles's probation officer was waiting to testify and confirmed that Charles had tested positive for methamphetamines that very morning, which violated every term of his probation, Emma's therapist submitted a detailed report showing how much emotional damage the supervised visits had caused and how Emma had started having nightmares and wetting the bed after each one. The report documented how she'd become stable and happy again once the visits stopped and was thriving in her current environment with me and Evan. On the final day of the hearing, the judge questioned Charles directly about those AA recordings Tommy had found. Charles tried to explain them away, but kept contradicting himself and getting the dates wrong, and finally just broke down sobbing that he couldn't remember what was real anymore. My lawyer's closing argument laid out the pattern, clearly showing not isolated incidents, but years of deliberate choices that put our family in danger while I fought for my life. She pointed to the evidence board covered in timelines and medical records and police reports, and asked the judge to see what was right in front of her. Charles's attorney stood up slowly and shuffled his papers for what felt like forever before clearing his throat. He talked about second chances and recovery being a disease, and how Charles deserved mercy because he was trying. His voice got quieter with each word, like he knew he was losing. The judge started writing notes while he talked and didn't look up once. When he finally sat down, Charles grabbed his arm hard enough to leave marks. The judge set down her pen and looked straight at Charles for the first time all day. She said she'd seen a lot of cases, but this one stood out for its extraordinary deception. She talked about how he'd weaponized his recovery story to manipulate the court system. Her voice got harder when she mentioned the medical records showing I'd attended every one of his appointments alone. She pointed out how he'd documented supposed abuse while I was getting chemo treatments. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. She granted me sole legal and physical custody with no visitation rights until Charles completed treatment and stayed sober for 1 full year with verified testing. Charles jumped up so fast his chair fell backwards and hit the floor with a bang. Charles failed a drug test the morning of his custody hearing while swearing he was sober. That's like showing up to your driving test drunk and wondering why they won't give you a license. His lawyer basically gave up mid-speech. He screamed that I'd destroyed his life and stolen his daughter and turned everyone against him. The bailiff moved toward him, but Charles kept yelling about how this was all my fault. He called me names I won't repeat and said Emma would hate me when she found out the truth. The judge banged her gavel and held him in contempt, and the bailiff grabbed his arms. They found out he'd violated his probation by missing 3 drug tests and arrested him right there. Outside the courthouse, my lawyer told me it was over, and the ruling was ironclad, and Charles couldn't appeal for at least a year. My mother and Evan stood with me in the parking lot while the reality sank in. We were too tired to celebrate or even smile. A week later, Emma asked about Daddy while she colored at the kitchen table. I told her he was sick and needed to get better, just like Mommy did when she had cancer. She nodded and went back to drawing rainbows with her new crayons. The legal bill came 3 days after that for $47,000. Evan and I sat at the table making a payment plan that would take 5 years to pay off. We agreed it was worth every penny for Emma's safety and our peace of mind. Charles's mother showed up at our door the next weekend with a birthday gift for Emma and old photos of Charles as a child. She said she'd support whatever relationship we were comfortable with separate from her son. She understood why we had to protect Emma and didn't blame us for the court's decision. Tommy called 2 weeks later to say Charles had entered a state-run facility after his jail time. He was finally getting real treatment, but Tommy doubted it would stick this time either. 3 months passed before I had to testify at Charles's probation violation hearing. For the first time, I told the full story without any legal strategy or careful wording. I talked about the bathroom floor and the bleeding and the nights alone during chemo. I talked about the promises he made and broke over and over again. I talked about finding him passed out when our baby needed feeding. The judge sentenced him to 6 months in jail, followed by mandatory inpatient treatment. His parental rights stayed suspended, and the criminal court judge actually stood up and told me I was brave for protecting Emma. 2 weeks after the trial, Jennifer came by for her last home visit, and she couldn't stop smiling while she watched Emma play with her blocks. She said the nightmares had stopped completely, and Emma was eating 3 full meals a day again, plus snacks. Her speech was back on track, and she was making friends at daycare instead of hiding in the corner during playtime. I went back to work full-time that next Monday without having having to leave early for court dates or supervised visits or emergency meetings with lawyers. My supervisor pulled me aside during my first shift back and said I looked like the nurse she hired 5 years ago instead of the ghost I'd been for months. The other nurses kept bringing me coffee and asking if I needed anything, but really I just needed to work and feel normal again. Evan and I started seeing a couples therapist every Thursday because even though Charles never laid a hand on him, the whole mess had taken its toll on us too. The therapist made us realize how much energy we'd spent managing Charles's chaos instead of building our own life together. She helped us see that we'd been in survival mode for so long, we forgot what peace felt like. 3 weeks later, we got a letter from Charles's lawyer saying he wouldn't fight the custody decision and was focusing on his recovery instead. The letter was short and formal and didn't mention Emma by name even once. September came and Emma started preschool at the little place down the street with the bright yellow door. That first morning, I expected tears or clinging, but she just grabbed her backpack and ran straight to the dress-up corner without looking back. I stood in the doorway for 5 minutes watching her put on a princess crown and introduce herself to another little girl. The teacher had to gently suggest I could probably go to work now. I went home and opened my jewelry box for the first time in 2 years and pulled out my old wedding ring from Charles. The pawn shop gave me $800 for it, which went straight into Emma's college fund to start replacing what we'd spent on lawyers. My mother flew back to Florida the next week after living with us for 6 solid months. At the airport, she hugged me tight and whispered that I was a better mother than she ever was because I actually protected my child. The nursing conference in October asked me to speak about recognizing abuse patterns in healthcare settings. I stood at that podium and told 300 nurses about the bathroom floor and the chemo appointments and the promises that meant nothing. I told them about the documentation and the twisted stories and how abusers can use the system against their victims. Nobody moved or checked their phones for the entire 20 minutes. Tonight, I'm standing in Emma's doorway with Evan watching her sleep with her stuffed elephant tucked under her chin. Her breathing is steady and calm and she doesn't wake up screaming anymore. The court orders are filed away and Charles's promises are just old echoes that don't hurt anymore. We won. Thanks for letting me wander through all of this with you. Definitely been quite the journey. Until we meet again, friends, subscribe for more content like this.